Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome to the Othmer Reading Room of the Center for Brooklyn History. It's really a magnificent space, and I think this conversation deserves to be in a space that commands all of our attention. My name is Marcia Eli. I am the Director of Programs here. I put together these conversations. Tonight's conversation is part of our fall series called Talks in the Othmer. It's 7 programs that explore historical themes and important issues of our day. The Talks in the Othmer series would really not be possible without the phenomenal support and partnership of New York University's Brooklyn-based 370J project. America's incarceration rate per 100,000 people is roughly twice that of Russia's and Iran's, 4 times that of Mexico's, 5 times that of England's, 6 times Canada's, and 9 times that of Germany's. And most of those people are Black and brown Americans. But we're not just talking about the mass here tonight. We're talking about the dysfunctional environment, culture, toxic scene. To do that, we have 2 pretty extraordinary people joining us. Bill Keller is the former executive editor of the New York Times and founding editor of the Marshall Project, and he is also the author of the new book, What's Prison For?, which The Guardian calls a concise diagnosis of a huge American problem. You might have noticed when you came in there was a book table where his book is available for purchase. And you might have noticed that there's actually another table down there with a selection of related books to this topic that you can check out from the Brooklyn Public Library, thanks to my colleague Lee Herkwitz. Thank you. So I hope that after this conversation we can gather down there. So joining the discussion tonight is Wesley Caines. There is lots to say about Wesley Caines, and I don't want to take up all the time doing that. I'm going to simply say that he is a true leader who has dedicated his life to prison reform. He is currently Chief of Staff at the Bronx Defenders and has spent years working directly with impacted communities who are ensnared in government systems. So I am honored to welcome Bill and Wesley to join me here. Please help me welcome them.
Thank you. That was great. I was glad
You're
you
welcome.
didn't take the time to say too much about me, because I'm sure all of that would not have been good.
That's going to come out.
I know that Bill wants to say a word or two, so Bill, I'll hand it over to you for a second.
Yeah, first, I'm sure Wesley will join me in this, thanking the Brooklyn Historical Society for inviting us here. I wanted to make 2 disclaimers. One of them is that I have Parkinson's, which explains why I have a microphone that I don't hold in my shaky hands, and will explain why my voice will sometimes sort of disappear. They also say that one symptom of Parkinson's is mild cognitive disorder, which means that anything I say that's incredibly stupid tonight, you can blame on the disease. My second disclaimer is that I'm a journalist, which is not the same as being an expert. In fact, it's sort of the opposite of being an expert. Wesley is an expert on a number of subjects that we'll talk about tonight. I think Bruce Western is here. He's quoted in the book. He's an expert at Columbia. Journalists call smart people like that and ask stupid questions, and that's sort of our MO. So if I start to sound smug or self-satisfied, discount for the fact that I'm a journalist, not an expert. Thank you.
Great. Where to begin? I think everyone in this room is aware, fully aware of the toxic environment that we're going to discuss that has become normalized. The word dehumanization seems to come up a lot when I read about prisons and jails, and it's often used. And I wanted to start by asking you both, What does that look like for real, dehumanization behind bars?
Wesley, you first. You're the expert on
Wow.
that subject in particular.
So that's interesting that you would start with that question. I think central to our carceral systems, and I pluralized it for a reason, is dehumanizing, right? And anytime we don't accept and see people, human beings in their fullness, we dehumanize them. Prisons are very unique in that, in the process of dehumanizing the people we have placed in cages, the jailers also are dehumanized. And that's a really important point to understand, that when you hear people talk about reducing mass incarceration, closing prisons, and you get the level of pushback from those who have attached their economic well-being to that system, it's not because they fundamentally disagree that it's a dehumanizing system. It's because they themselves has been dehumanized and don't think that they will have any other opportunity to have thriving, meaningful lives where they can take care of their families and loved ones. And that's the basis for the pushback. And I would make an argument that that's really seriously tied to how it is our legal systems dehumanize people into thinking and losing an imagination and a wonder for the world and what is possible. And unfortunately, in this country, that often happens and is projected towards black and brown and poor people. And it's something that cannot be divorced from the conversation and the system, is the role that race plays, anti-blackness plays, fear plays, and it's all tied together. It's all tied together.
I just supplement that by stressing that the dehumanization is not sort of a coincidence. It's not something that just happens. It's by design. Correctional officers are trained in this country, not in more enlightened countries. Corrections officers are trained for a matter of weeks, and the training emphasizes crowd control and self-defense. There's rarely a murmur of sociology or psychology or anything that would be humanizing. And we can argue, I guess, about the extent to which this is actually written out in a game plan, but the outcome is that it becomes a method of control.
How did we get here?
It's a kind of glib to say it starts with slavery, but it starts with slavery. And then came the 13th Amendment, which has a big loophole in it. Those of you who don't remember your constitutional law, the 13th Amendment outlaws slavery with one large exception for people who've been convicted of crimes. So particularly in the South, what that led to was, instead of having the plantation tended to by people that the owner, that the master owned, you had the fields tended by prisoners who were arrested on contrived charges, and you have slavery by another name. That's sort of the origin story of mass incarceration.
There's a very, if I may add, there's a very important part of that origin story that's really interesting to me, in that prisons as we know them today, which are segregated spaces out of sight, in the early days, the 1800s, were occupied by white people. Most people don't realize that today because we look at prisons and jails across this country and we mostly see people of color. But that wasn't always the case. That became a phenomenon after World War II, right? And you ask yourself why, and Bill's answer explains why. Because black and brown people, mostly black people, were just summarily killed on the streets if they offended or they were perceived to have offended, or they were placed back on plantations for things like loitering, vagrancy, not looking or saying or doing the thing that a white person asks them to do. So the institutional structures of prisons were occupied by white people, mostly white poor men, who, even in their poverty, had a higher status of value as white than black people. So they got the benefit of going to an institution, not going back to a plantation where themselves likely or their ancestors had been freed from. And after World War II, that began to shift. You get to the 60s, and there's some very important like markers for this, right? It's the civil rights era, transition into the Black Power era, and then the affirmative action era, and then the war on drugs era. And all of those eras are lily pads by which white people were mostly transitioned out of institutional prisons, and black and mostly brown people were transitioned in. So it's really important to, in answering the question as to how we got here, why it is we're having a different conversation now around mass incarceration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd like to dig in a little bit more, Wesley, around the centrality of race. You said race is central when we talked last week, and the criminalization of race and how that plays out through things like the crack epidemic and income inequality. And I'd like to understand that a little bit better as it plays out now, today.
Yeah, it's everywhere, and I'm going to say this. It's marginally controversial if you're not really a deep thinker, I would say. But white supremacy, like the drivers of white supremacy are not all white people. So in the year 2022, you may have black and brown people who are in very seemingly influential positions who are espousing and advancing white supremacist ideals, sometimes not even realizing that they're doing so. That plays out today in instances where we're having conversation around why cannabis, a plant, carries with it, first of all, we criminalize the plant. That's one question that should be answered. But then you would put cannabis in the same category as heroin, right? You would take cocaine and cook it, create crack. Both are devastating substances that wreaks havoc on an individual, but also on communities and families. And you would place the sanctions for possessing them at different rates because of
100 to 1.
Exactly, who consumes them, right? So almost in any public institution that we really shine light into, you will find undergirding some of the most devastating effects of them is tied to race.
Right.
Our tax code, how we choose to fund our schools, all of those things are tied to race and where people live and allowed to live. Whether or not you can get a loan in 2022, like there was recently last week, a community bank in New Jersey that was sanctioned because they were not providing home mortgages to black communities. Not to individuals, like the whole communities that were predominantly black, they did not provide mortgages to. So it's really hard to overstate how it is government institutions, government policies, and sometimes black and brown actors acting under the color of the government really advance white supremacist ideals that have devastating consequences, including prisons.
I would add maybe two other factors. One of them is opportunism, starting with, pick your favorite Republican hard-ass president. They realize that fear-mongering is a great way to gather votes, especially when the crime rate is high and people are scared. The other thing I would point to is class. It's implicit in everything that Wesley's saying, but that we don't talk about enough the extent to which it's the economic inequities that are paired with the racial inequities. I want to read a quote. It's in your honor, Bruce. This is Bruce Western. Mass incarceration flows along the lines of social and economic inequality. Its signal characteristics are massive racial inequality and massive class inequality. It's a system that concentrates all of its efforts on low-income communities of color.
So, we are talking about prisons as if they're all the same, which of course we know they're not, prisons and jails. And, one of the lines in the book is, if you've seen one prison,
you've seen one prison.
You've seen one prison, right. And that complicates things even more, I would imagine, when it comes to trying to see a light of some kind. But I'd like to find out a little bit more about what that means. Like, what makes all these cages, as you would say, so different and distinct? How come they have different cultures, and what are their cultures, and how do they vary?
Maybe we should talk a little about Sing Sing, since you spent some time there.
Yeah.
That pleasant. And because we were talking about in the green room before, that you would think that Sing Sing prison, which is located in an affluent county, Westchester, with hundreds and hundreds of people, nice neighbors willing to volunteer to run programs for prisoners, you would think that it would have a kind of more high-minded and docile culture, or at least a more literate culture than your typical prison. But it's not that simple, is it?
It's not that simple at all. Sing Sing, like most prisons, have very high walls, and most people don't take the time to look over those walls or go through those walls to find out what's happening. And, to say that if you visit one prison, you have visited one prison is so true. Each prison's culture is unique. It is the product of, first and foremost, the administrators who run the particular prison, and it is a symbiotic relationship between staff and those who are incarcerated, which creates a culture. And Sing Sing is unique because its proximity to New York City. It's like 45 minutes drive away. It's also unique in that up until very recently, it had the highest proportion of any maximum security prison in New York State of staff of color. So you would think, and this goes back to my prior statement, you would think that a facility that has staff of color, reflective of the people who we have placed in cages, would look to do things differently, to be a beacon as to what's possible for the other prisons that are further in the North Country that we tend to point our fingers at and say how brutal they are and how racist they are. But Sing Sing has its own flaws. Sing Sing operates on an economic and social system that most people who go in to do the programs, because it's close to New York City, may go in to do theater programs, and there are two vibrant college programs in Sing Sing. So on the one hand, there's this environment of opportunities for transformation by the people who are incarcerated, but then if you peek behind a curtain, you have illicit sex, illicit drugs, like an economy that operates. You would not believe the extent to which cash money circulates within Sing Sing. You would not believe that some guards and those people who are incarcerated aligned with them control the alcohol trade or the heroin or the cocaine or the cannabis trade. It's literally a lived, alive, vibrant economy that most people are unaware of. What we learn about Sing Sing is when something really bad happens that just escapes the confines of the wall, right? Someone loses their life, someone is accused of something particularly more heinous, or at least this time they're caught, and there's usually no consequences to those things, but it makes its way out, and we kind of look, and then turn away because what we see is ourselves reflected there, right? It's the fact that we have chosen as a society to put all the things that we don't like, starting with blackness, which we are afraid of, mental illness, substance abuse, and all the other things that I can think of, and we put them behind this wall, and we hope that they don't sneak out and rock our consciousness, because then we become complicit in what happens there. But I would make the argument that it can't stay behind a wall forever, and Sing Sing is just one example. I can tell you about Eastern Correctional Facility, which is literally about 45 minutes from Sing Sing, and historically had a very different culture. And that was driven by the fact that the superintendent of that facility did not come up through the ranks of the security, which is the guards, which is typical for most superintendents, at least in New York State. They rose through the ranks of corrections officer, sergeant, lieutenant, captain, and then they go into administrative roles. And most of them take a very, you hear it today in the street, tough on crime stance. Put them in solitary confinement, beat them up, bully them, make them adjust to the facility's will. This particular superintendent had a different philosophy. He came up as an educator. He came into the system as a teacher, became a facility principal, and then went into administration. So he had a strong belief that education could transform people, and created an environment where he literally said to staff, my facility will be ran in a particular way, and if this is not the way that works for you to do your jobs, then I will sign a transfer to any facility of your choosing, but this is going to be a therapeutic facility. And the culture shifted. For over 15 years that he was superintendent, the culture, officers did not walk around with nightsticks. They spoke to people humanely. And after he left, 2 superintendents removed, the culture of the facility shifted and became more like other maximum security prisons. I mean, that's an example where an individual made a difference, and he was a particularly strong individual. It's very unusual that you find that on the positive side. But each prison has a very different culture, very different.
There's something to replicate that is, good to hear, that there's something to replicate.
Yeah, one of the reviewers of my book described me as an optimist on the subject of the criminal justice system. I'm a long way from being an optimist, in part because, to quote Deanna Hoskins in a conversation we had last week, the prison system is a catchment for all the problems outside prisons, the economic problems, the cultural problems, the hates. They all drain down into this swamp that is the prison system. But having said that, if you read this book, you'll notice that I focus on people who are actually trying to make a difference. Not that they're going to win anytime soon, but that there's at least cause for some incremental good to be done, and people should know more about those examples so that they can emulate them. And maybe we get more leaders like the guy you described, who single-handedly changed the culture.
I definitely want to talk about some things that are, I won't say hopeful or optimistic, but that we can think can be replicated. But I also want to ask first a little bit about, your subtitle for the book is Punishment and Rehabilitation in the Age of Mass Incarceration. And, my question is, what is appropriate punishment, and when does it tip into, nightmare and horror and insanity and gross unfairness? I mean, what is that balance between punishment and tipping too far away from justice?
That's a good question, but it's one that's almost impossible to answer except in specific cases. This country has a 200-plus year history of this underlying tension. I sometimes think of it as Quaker America and Puritan America, just because the original idea for a penitentiary that rehabilitates was organized by Quakers in Philadelphia in Ben Franklin's day. He was one of them. There's a part of the American, it's partly myth, but the American ideology that we believe in redemption and second chances, and sometimes we behave that way. Lately, not so much. And then there's the punitive aspect of which is, I'm sure, embedded in human nature. We need a philosopher for this part of the conversation. Who of us has not had a sort of surge of joy at somebody who killed a black man, a cop who killed a black man got indicted, or that Bernie Madoff got sentenced to 150 years for ripping off all the people of their life savings? I mean, there is an emotional quality to the punitive streak. And I guess the general answer to your question is you have to divorce the criminal justice system from raw emotion. Raw emotion can be pandered to, and it can lead you into the sort of awful things you're describing.
Yeah, I struggle with the notion of rehabilitation. My experience is that when we talk about rehabilitation, whether it's during incarceration or post-incarceration, it's really about making the people that we want to rehabilitate accept the conditions under which we have them living. And, you know, in prison, and for full disclosure, if that hasn't been kind of apparent, I am formerly incarcerated. And I don't lead with that because I would appreciate that what I have to say is important because it's important, not because it's coming from someone who's formerly incarcerated. But with that, I'll say that what I've seen while incarcerated is that the system is concerned with compliance. And to the extent that someone is able to stay below the radar and follow direction and instruction and jump and how high when given those instructions, they are deemed rehabilitated. For those who push back, for those who say no, for those who are incapable cognitively of responding to those types of instructions, they are abused, they are tortured with solitary confinement, and many are chemically restrained in the form of medication. And 3 times a day, you go to any New York State facility or Rikers Island, and they do a med run, and the line for medications, which if you subtract the people who are diabetic and receiving their insulin, or folks who have other medical conditions that are non-mental health, if you remove them, the vast majority of the folks who are getting medications are getting psychotropic medications to control them. And the system spends an enormous amount of time and investment bullying people while incarcerated to be compliant, and then turn around upon release and expect that the same people who you have taught that the way you get compliance is through sheer might and power should now transition into civic beings who are concerned about their neighbors and community and will not bully their neighbors and community. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. So, you know, rehabilitation is, for me, is really, you know, a question of how well we could make the consequences so dire for people that it will make them respond in a way that accept the conditions on the which we have them living. And you know, when you talk about communities that, that catchment of all the communities' ills. So communities that are not adequately resourced, and then people go into survival mode, right? They're not thriving, they're surviving. They have been excluded from many things: quality education, quality health care, mental health, quality housing. And they have found ways to build community within those communities to be supportive of each other. And some of those things that they have found to build community has been criminalized. And we haven't addressed that, though. We then put them in cages and then bring them back, and the conditions are the same, so the behavior is the same, and they go back and forth. I somewhat disagree, because I think that individual people give second chances. I'm here because a lot of individuals invested in me and gave me a second chance. Where you don't find a meaningful opportunity for a second chance is that the government has erected barriers to that second chance. Like, the government narrative is that we are a Judeo-Christian society that believes in second chances and redemption, and then there are 47,000 laws and local ordinances around this country that says once you have been arrested, much less convicted of an offense,
You're fucked.
you will never again be civically whole.
Yeah.
Like, period. You will never again exist civically in the same way as someone else who does not have that experience. But for most people, justice and accountability is bookended by, punishment and some post-punishment period. But that's not really a reality. It's in perpetuity that you suffer even after you feel as if you have paid your debt to society.
I want to just for a second play devil's advocate, or maybe rehabilitation advocate. When we were talking before, you said you think it's more likely that people who are rehabilitated in spite of the prison system and not because of it. And I grant you that's probably true. But you yourself got multiple degrees while you were incarcerated. Do you?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I had awesome opportunities, awesome investment in me. Here's why I think that my experience should not be seen as the standard. It's an exception, not because I'm exceptional, because I'm not. It's an exception because, like, the thread into that needle that I was meant that a lot of other threads did not get an opportunity to get into that needle. I am one of 14 men who were in the first cohort of the Barred Prison Initiative. We were in the program. It's a college degree program. We were in the program before it was officially recognized by docs, New York State regents. The only people who believed in us and the possibility of us doing college level, liberal arts level work was the founder of BPI, Max Kenner, and the president of Bard College, Leon Botstein, right? However, the 14 of us had to compete against the 250 men in Eastern Correctional Facility who filled out the application, sat for the entrance essay, were interviewed. 250 to 14, I would argue that that is not an institution that is committed to rehabilitation. It is not. It is literally skimming the top and asking folks to believe that if the other 240 people who did not get in come home and now can't have the same opportunities that I've been privileged to have because of those degrees, that it's their fault because Wesley Caines, he came home and he's a chief of staff at the public defender office that's nationally known. But if you don't pull behind the curtain and if you don't look at the opportunities that I received, like by luck, we're going to choose to put people in cages. Everyone should have access to opportunities that is legitimately about rehabilitation. However, the system weaponizes those rehabilitative opportunities, both college and training programs. If you don't comply, if someone doesn't like you, they don't like the way you carry yourself, if they don't like the people you hang out with, if they don't like the way your hairstyle, you will not get into that vocational program, you will not get into the college program.
And you sure as hell won't get a Pell Grant.
And you sure as hell won't get a Pell Grant. So what I'm arguing against is that institutionally, we have not made a commitment. Well, let me step back. When you think about it, our current president, who doesn't escape my wrath, was the drafter of, the crime bill, the 1994 crime bill, which led to the decimation of colleges in prisons and jails around this country. And not long after that, Governor Pataki did the same with the state TAP tuition assistance program in New York State. So not only did, 4-year degree granting colleges leave under the crime bill, but then the 2-year associate's degree programs left with the community colleges when TAP left. So all of this speaks to, how do you value the people? I'm going to quote Leon Botstein, because I think he said it best several years ago at a commencement address. He said, if we as a society are going to say to people, regardless of what they have done, we can have our judgments on that. I've met people in prison who have been convicted of very serious, heinous, devastating, destructive crimes. I myself was convicted of such a crime. And so I'm not making an excuse about the behaviors that myself and others have engaged in if folks are guilty. Got to make that disclaimer. But if we are going to choose to put men and women in this country in cages, I think it's also our moral obligation to provide them with the means to be better human beings when they step out of those cages. And if we don't do that, then we're literally reaping what we sow when we have a recidivism rate which is off the charts. Like if you bought a car and it failed at the rate that prisons fail to rehabilitate, you would take it back under the lemon law. Well, we have tons of lemons in New York State and across this country by way of prisons and jails. They don't work.
I want to get to some of the examples, Bill, that are in the book of what one person called mind-blowing when they saw what was happening in other countries and maybe even other prisons in our country. But I actually first want to ask you both whether abolition is an answer.
Bill.
The next issue of the New York Review of Books includes an article I wrote reviewing a couple of books by abolitionists, Mary May Cava and Ruth Wilson Gilmore. Blame the Parkinsons. I'm not good at memory retrieval. And first of all, I think you got to give the abolition movement credit for being early and incisive about what a mess the criminal justice system is, how it doesn't work. They've dissected and explained that before the progressives got to that subject. I have two issues with the abolition movement. One of them is, even if you believe that this world with no cops and no prisons of any kind and no violence is achievable, I'm not entirely sure it'd be desirable. For the simple reason that there are going to be rules. There could be much better rules, saner rules, but there are going to be rules and guideposts, and somebody has to enforce them. So either you get some equivalent of sort of crowdsourced justice, which sounds a lot like mob rule to me, or you essentially recreate the police system, and maybe you recreate a better one, but it's not going to be no police system at all. That's my one argument with the practicality of it. The other is, if this great world is coming, it's going to come in generations, not in years. And what do you do with all the people who are being victimized by the system now? You just tell them, sorry, you guys, you got to wait for the revolution?
Yeah,
No holds
abolition.
barred.
Yeah, abolition is complicated because I could imagine, like in the 1850s, as folks was talking about abolishing slavery, there was a strong opposition to thinking that that would be possible, that the South would ever go for that, that, you know, there are these strong sentiments even in the North where slavery had been outlawed, where folks are like, well, that's not the best system to have. We don't have that here, but still don't want the black people living next to me, right? So I think there's a lot of that when you think about abolition, right? There's this sense of lacking a cultural imagination that could have us look beyond where we are for what's possible. And I think the challenge of abolition today is that the infrastructure for abolition has to be built. But it's a massive undertaking. It's creating, you know, systems of accountability. It's making citizens and members of our society think that and believe that and act in a way that to be civically engaged doesn't mean voting every 2 or 4 years. It means to be engaged in your community life every day. It means to value people every day. It means to stand up to systems, government systems, you know, in a particular way every day. And unless and until we could build that infrastructure of housing, education, some degree of equitable distribution of resources that would then allow for us to think of what's possible, I don't know that I agree that it's generations away, not decades away. But I also believe strongly that it's possible and that eventually it'll happen. I think that we see every day where people are a little bit more fed up by things. And it's easy to blame individuals when things happen. You know, cops puts his knee on a black person's neck and kills him. We see it. It's an affront to all of us. And we put that cop in prison for the rest of his life. We feel good about that. But then something else equally egregious happens and we do the cycle again. I'm hopeful that eventually we will realize that it's not those individuals that's the problem. It's the system that's the problem. The system that incentivizes and allows for those individuals to believe that that's acceptable behavior. And I think until we start stripping the system of its power over our lives, I think it's going to be very hard to bring in any different system, whether it's abolitionism or some other thing other than what we have now. But clearly what we have now is not working for some of us. It's working for others, but not for all of us. And I think that there are more and more people who are recognizing that in their name, this system is not okay. And I wouldn't do this work if I didn't believe that it was possible for us to change, for us to be different and do different. And you know, we have had a lot of iterations as a country. Slavery, segregation, Jim Crow. You know, we have a long way to go, but the needle has moved, and there's no reason why it can't move further. I just think we have to believe it, and we have to have people with vision who we place in the position of allowing resources to get to the places that they need to get to.
Yeah, I
How's
think.
that working out?
Well, we elect cops and we get cop policies. I don't know.
Yeah.
That's part of the civic maturity that needs to happen. Like, frankly, it's a discussion, and it's hard. It's hard for me as a black man to sit here and to make a comment like that about another black man who has ascended to a position that's really laudable. But the fact is that simply, you know, mirroring the same behaviors and policies and talking points of an oppressive racist system and having a black actor doing that is frankly unacceptable, and it should be unacceptable to all of us.
There's a lot that I feel I won't see in my lifetime, that we can still hope for, but.
But to credit us with having sometimes surprising imagination, I would not have believed that marriage equality was going to happen in my lifetime, and then it did.
Exactly.
We're in a minute, we're going to go to audience questions. So if you have one, think about it. And but I wanted to, Bill, ask one more question from me, which really is about that mind-blowing word. This is, you write about some American prison reform advocates who go visiting in other parts of the country and the world, and that these countries lock up fewer people for much shorter time is not something that surprised them. It's how they treat those they do incarcerate, you're right, was mind-blowing. So I'd love to hear just a little bit about some of those examples.
Yeah, back in 2015, I think it was, we sent a reporter along with one of those delegations that the Vera Institute organized. Governor Malloy of Connecticut was on that trip, and his corrections department head. And in working on the book, I talked to them just to sort of plumb their memories. There are two things that really blow their minds when they go there. One of them is just the normality of the prisons. Not all of them, but the best prisons are more like college campuses. People have normal life routines. They wake themselves up in the morning and go to class or work, whatever their job is. If they have a job, it's paid. And they're required to set a portion of it aside to help adjust when they get out. There are trees in the yards of these prisons. The basic principle of to slightly overgeneralize, is that punishment is the deprivation of freedom. That's what we've decided, that's how we're going to punish you. All those other things, all those other rights you had as citizen, you retain. Mm-hmm. The right to conjugal visits with your spouse, the right to be safe from violence, the right to vote. Only 2 states in the United States allow incarcerated felons to vote, Maine and Vermont, rah-rah. Yeah. The other thing that blew their minds, maybe even more so, was the role that staff plays. In Germany, if you're going to be a corrections officer, you're going to do a 2-year course, college-level course with training in human rights law and psychology. That's compared to maybe 2 or 4 weeks of self-defense maneuvers that you learn in an American training program. And the way that safety is achieved in European prisons, the good European prisons, is because the officers interact constantly with the inmates, treat them with respect, and sense if there's some emotional breakdown about to come or some conflict that's going on, then they can generally head it off before it turns violent. Now again, this is the best of the prisons in Europe. And we're not Norway. I mean, Norway is a homogeneous, affluent welfare state. But that's a number of those people who made those pilgrimages to Norway and Germany came back thinking there's some things we can learn from this. And a number of them have tried. They're all small programs. The problem with pilot programs is they're very hard to scale up. So I don't, there's one of my favorites is in Chester, Pennsylvania prison, the place that they've called Little Scandinavia. I don't think the rest of the Chester correctional facility is going to go that way. It costs too much money. You have to do away with the cages and provide a more livable infrastructure. You have to train those staffers. You have to have a much larger staff ratio so that they're available to perform this more social worker role. So, again, I'm not an optimist, but I think it's a worthwhile investment and a moral imperative.
For sure. Questions? We have a microphone that will come around.
I can talk loud.
It'd be great to wait because we are recording. Oh, thanks, Wesley.
Thank you. I read recently that there are enormous court costs and fines, and that some states even charge prisoners room and board, essentially. Can you tell us more about that? That makes people have to, they can't pay their fines, so they go back to jail.
Yeah, there are a lot of ways in which, like, even incarcerated people who make 8 to 12 cents an hour doing prison labor, that's not an exaggeration, that's actually the pay scale, who also have attached to them fines and fees connected to their convictions. And for some folks, it could run into the thousands of dollars, because if they have multiple conviction, each one carries its own costs. And, that's deducted from your income while you're in at a 20% rate. So 20% of your income goes to pay that back. That does not include restitution. Restitution also sits on top of those fines and fees if those were imposed by the court. If you get resources from loved ones outside, those are taxed at 50%. So if you send a loved one $100 for their commissary, they actually only get 50, because the other 50 goes to pay these fines and fees. But then the system is really perverse in that it turns it also, right? So it doesn't just punish the person who was convicted and incarcerated. It also charges the people who choose to love them and support them. So for me to call you, you would have to pay an exorbitant rate for a phone call from someone who's incarcerated. If, New York State now has instituted an email system, the federal system has had it for some times, but each email you have to pay for. So you figure email, why am I paying for email? It's like, what, electricity, what? But you have to pay per email to send an email, both to them and them to you. So, there are all of these ways where the system really extracts. There have been almost each legislative session, some person in mostly the state Senate, especially when the Republicans had the state Senate, someone would draft legislation to charge room and board of prisoners. Those fines and fees, by the way, follows you after incarceration. So you're still responsible for them once you're out, which means you can't get a good credit rating.
You can't vote in some places. Right?
Some states, some jurisdictions, you cannot vote unless you have paid all of your fees. So it's really like this cycle of, like, it's in perpetuity that you are never civically whole again.
Yeah, Florida had, a few years back, had a case of, they passed a piece of legislation to enfranchise formerly incarcerated people with a few exceptions. And the governor very cleverly said, yes, we're going to let you vote after you've been incarcerated, but first you have to pay all of these debts. Yeah. And a couple other states have emulated his example. These bad ideas spread.
That was passed by referendum. So the voters of Florida said formerly incarcerated people should have the right to vote. They're paying taxes, they're working, they should vote. And the governor then was like, okay, I'll allow that, but first you owe money. And until you satisfy that debt, voting is off the table.
So 2 things. One, just a reminder that all skin folks aren't kin folks, so your mayor will disappoint. The second thing is, just to speak locally, so I feel like in New York City, we tried bail reform. And now every crime that's committed, that's on the news, is blamed on bail reform. So if we can't get on the side of bail reform, how are we ever going to get to abolition, even if it's generations away?
Great question. I mean, we have proxy discussions, public discourse by proxy. We have race conversations by proxy, and bail is one of those conversations that we're currently having that's a proxy for race. There are a lot of folks who are just afraid of black people, black men in particularly, and that's not to minimize or to justify the very senseless, heinous offenses that has been in the news lately and over the past 2 years of the pandemic. I'm not doing that. But there's a disconnect, and the data actually now is coming out on bail reform that shows bail and the bail reform that happened is not the driver of the instances of offenses that we're seeing on the news every week, where the other side will have you convinced that because people are at liberty while they defend themselves against the state, that has inherently made us all less safe. The fact is, if I was wealthy and I was arrested for killing 10 people and given a $10 million bail that I could make, it wouldn't matter if I got out on my own recognizance or if I paid that $10 million. And prior to bail reform, that's literally what was happening. People who had means or whose families had means to go get a bail bondsman or to pool monies together meant that certain people, no matter what they were charged with, were getting out of jail and were able to fight their cases from the comfort of their homes. While poor people who could not afford, and the studies were clear, $500. There were hundreds of people in Rikers who could not afford to pay $500 or less bail, or less. New York State passed a charitable bail fund law which allowed for charities to pay bail for misdemeanor offenses of less than $2,500. And bail funds popped up around the state, New York City in particular. And over the next several years since that law, the data showed that the people that the bail fund were bailing out, there were a couple of stark things that stood out. Number one, poor people showed up in court to live up to their responsibility to face charges against them. And number two, the outcome of their cases was dramatically different than their counterparts who were still incarcerated. So the system incentivizes pleas. Most people don't, how many people here know that trials are like an anomaly? Trials don't happen anywhere except in Hollywood.
1 out of 40, I think.
Exactly. Like, it's literally a fiction that we have our day in court, that we see our witnesses against us, that we are able to defend ourselves. That's just not how our system works. We have cast such a wide net of criminalizing sometimes complete communities that should the system not have the mechanism to incentivize people to plead out their cases to get out of jail, the system would literally break on its own weight. It could not sustain trials for every person who it had locked up for offenses that are frankly poverty crime. Now, I got to admit that as someone who stood on the side of pushing for bail reform, we were kind of naive in thinking that after bail, discovery, and speedy trial reform were passed in the state, that we had arrived somewhere. We had put some equity into our system of legal system. And I think what we did not realize was the extent to which there were forces that would never rest not being able to cage people. Like, for some folks, that's the beginning, the middle, and the end for everything. So you're going to keep on hearing about bail reform. I commend the governor that she's been astute enough politically to not kind of be baited into, recalling the legislature and trying again to amend the bail reforms, it doesn't make sense. The data doesn't support it. The drivers of the crime that's happening is not bail. It's conditions under which people are living. It's mental health issues. It's resource lacking in certain communities. And for some folks, they just don't want to have that conversation, because if you talk about reallocation of resources, you're a socialist. If you talk about a police agency that has a larger, more well-resourced intelligence unit than the Central Intelligence Agency, I'm not sure people realize that, NYPD has an intelligence department that has global reach. NYPD have spies, many of whom are ex-military and ex-American spies from CIA, NSA, who have transitioned into NYPD and operate overseas in this country in many communities. We don't want to have that conversation. Why is a municipal policing agency allowed to have the resources to allow it to have such a department and to have such a global reach? That's a question that, someone else will have to answer. But where we choose to put our billions says a lot. And where we choose to put people when they're struggling also says a lot. Rikers Island is literally a mental health institution. It's a jail secondarily.
The question about bail reform reminds me of something, this is a bit of a tangent, but something that I, as the sole representative of the mass media here, I'd like to say that we're complicit. That from time to time, the media has taken the word of fear-mongering politicians and sensationalized stories about youthful predators, for example. I think that at least the serious media, as I think of it, has gotten better about that, thanks in part to a lot of noise and a lot of killings of black men by white cops, and books like Michelle Alexander's New Jim Crow and things like that. It's getting better, but then something like bail reform comes up, and if you turn on your local TV, they're just parroting the story of the guy who got out on bail reform and committed a heinous crime. I hoped we were over that, but I'm not so sure.
We have time for one more question.
Okay. I just want to know what your opinions are on the closed Rikers initiative and the city's plans to open I think it's 3 or so jails across Brooklyn, Queens, and Manhattan, I believe. And if you just think that the Bronx, sorry, and if you just think it's another means to, I guess, just move the culture of Rikers from one place to another without actually addressing the structural issues within the jail.
No, I mostly want you to take a stab at it.
Thank you.
Well, one thing I will say is that, say what you will about Bill de Blasio, but probably the single most radical thing he did during his tenure was agree, at least in principle, and more than in principle, to close Rikers and to build more humane facilities for them in the boroughs. He encountered a lot of opposition from the union, the officers' union, a lot of the sort of not in my backyard sentiment that you would expect. But they also encountered a lot of opposition from the abolitionists, who were absolute about not building new prisons, but didn't have an alternative.
Yeah, so having spent time at Rikers, I support its closure. Not sure there's a way that you could sufficiently address the inhumane environment that it is. There's been a lot chronicled about it, so I won't get into it. I will say that a generation ago, New York City had borough-based jails. People forget that. They were borough-based jails. Brooklyn House was reopened, several years ago, but they had all closed. Queens House, Brooklyn House, Bronx House of Detention, like they all closed. And I can tell you that those borough-based jails, being close to where you were arrested and possibly where you lived, did not make them more humane. Like Rikers is a grease fire, and if you pour water on it, it's going to spread. The culture will spread to any new jails. So while I support, building, closing Rikers, I think the city has to really think hard about what it will mean to invest the amount of money that will see the erection of 4 new jails. And I think that if the notion is that they will be closer to home, more humane, have services that community members can utilize, then I would say those are not reasons to open new jails, because it's going to be mirrors of what Rikers has become. Ironically, Rosie's, which is the female and transgender community facility at Rikers, when it was opened several decades ago, was opened in response to the old women's house at Rikers, which was inhumane, perverse. Women were victimized by incarcerated men and men on staff. It was really bad. And Rosie's came online in this way to be more humane and responsive to the fact that we were choosing to put women in cages, and very quickly became just another jail at Rikers with the same problems. So if that's an example, then I think we have to wrestle with that. But I do support closing Rikers. The question of new jails, I think, is one for all of us to kind of talk about and figure that out.
I would be remiss if I didn't tell all of you one last thing about the Brooklyn Public Library. If you don't know that we have a Justice Initiatives office, know that your library, your Brooklyn Public Library, has an office that supports incarcerated and formerly incarcerated patrons and their families. They bring books to Rikers, and there are reentry services, and I just want you to know that. So, but mostly, I really want to thank you both for this conversation, which was so powerful, and so many takeaways for me, and I think everybody. It really was an incredible discussion. So, thank you, and thank you all for coming, and join us downstairs and look at books of all kinds. Thank you.
I look forward to coming back for Wesley's book.
Yes, that's a
Thank
deal.
you all. Thank you. And thank you, Bill. This was great. Thank you.